Welcome to Tritiyo Matra. US President Biden will host a virtual summit for leaders from government, civil society, and the private sector on December 9 and 10, 2021. The summit will concentrate on the challenges and possibilities that democracies face, and it will give a forum for leaders to make individual and collective commitments to safeguard democracy and human rights both at home and abroad. The fundamental aspects of being human is having rights to life and liberty, right to have opinions and freedom to express them, right to cast ballots, choose leaders and when necessary criticize and hold them accountable. Even after more than 70 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are continuously being violated with impunity. Constitutionally protected rights are also failing the population of many developing and least developed nations. In recent times, we can see a regression of human rights and a continuous violation of human rights. According to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms and the principle of holding periodic and genuine elections by universal suffrage are essential elements of democracy. Unfortunately, in all these regards, Bangladesh's performance has been abysmal. Today's episode, which is the second in a series of 4 shows structured around the themes of the upcoming virtual December Democracy Summit, will attempt at exploring these burning issues in the context of South Asia and Bangladesh. Today's theme is advancing respect for human rights. To discuss which, I have 3 eminent guests with me: Abdulwahab Alkebsi, Managing Director Programs, Center for International Private Enterprise CIPE, a US-based non-profit organization that works to strengthen democracy through private enterprise and market-oriented reforms since 1983. Barbara Langley, Director, Center for Women Economic Empowerment CIPE, and Barrister Sara Hossain, Member IID Governing Body, Lawyer, Supreme Court of Bangladesh, and Honorary Director, Legal Aid and Service Trust, BLAST, Member of the Human Rights Committee of the Women's International Coalition on Gender Justice. Welcome to you all. Let me start with this. Democracy is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Abraham Lincoln, United States 16th President, said this in 1860s, and the world believes and repeats this till today. Yet, why is it that we still have to talk about the relationship between human rights and democracy? What is preventing this relationship from maturing to the point of eliminating the need for still having to talk about? Mr. Abdulwahab.
Thank you very much, Zailur, and thank you for having me on your show. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here with Barrister Sara Hossain and with Barb Langley. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and this is a very, very important subject for us to discuss at a very important time. And you stated it very well, Zailur, in your opening comments, the importance of human rights. I mean, the way I see this is democracy is both a process which we tend to focus on, the process of democracy, elections, working with political parties, working with parliaments, a presidential system versus a parliamentary system. And that is the process that the news and people focus on. We tend to forget about values of democracy and human rights, rule of law, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. All of these are extremely important values. And without them, the process is not enough. The process is absolutely necessary, but not sufficient. Without believing in the values of democracy, you have no democracy. In addition to that, I talked about the process, and elections are probably the most prominent of all of these processes within a democratic system. During elections, we tend to pique our attention, news media cover it, people go out and participate, and it's an exciting time. And absolutely, without them, without the right of the people to choose the representatives, you do not have a democracy. However, that's not sufficient also. What happens in between elections is also extremely important. How to build the institutions of democracy. And we tend to lose attention during that time and not focus on that so much. And they are as important, if not important. So once we select the people that represent us in parliaments, in government, how do they govern? Governance in between elections is also very important. And that's when the focus on human rights should be. How do we work on making sure human rights are an integral part of a democracy? How do we make sure that minority rights is an important part of democracy? And how do we strengthen civil society to participate in a democracy in between elections? How do we make sure citizens participate in a democracy in between elections? And finally, on this point, Zilur, democracies are not perfect. They get stronger and weaker like a human body. They get sick. They need continuous care. They need continuous nourishment. And we cannot forget that. Democracy today around the world is facing tremendous challenges. It is like a sick body right now that needs that nourishment, that needs all of us to engage and to help it succeed and move forward. I believe in democracy. We believe, all of us as CIPE and all of us in here believe in a democracy, but we need to work at it. It's not guaranteed if we don't work very, very hard at it.
Thank you, Mr. Abdulwahab. Ms. Barbara.
Yes, thank you, Zilur, and thank you again for the opportunity to address you today. I've been to your country several times and just thrilled to be able to join you for this discussion. When we're talking about democracy and human rights, I absolutely agree with Abdulwahab. And I think what I would do is underscore the idea that democracies are an active approach. In a democracy, our governments give us the parameters in which we can work freely, that we can operate freely. And it's really up to us as citizens, as constituents, to be active and involved and to make that come to fruition. It can look messy, it can look a little disjointed sometimes, but that's really where the rubber hits the road, as we say, where things come to fruition.
Thank you, Barbara. Barrister Sara Hossain. Barrister Sara Hossain is on the way actually, and she'll join us at the studio very soon. But we'd like to hear from you, Barrister Sara Hossain.
Sure. Thank you, Zilur Bhai, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about this, and apologies for my situation. I think I would agree with the previous speakers that the opportunities for participation of people in the process of democracy is really critical. And this is where we need to look at what kinds of laws are being applied and how they're being applied. In terms of, we obviously in Bangladesh, we have a constitution which does recognize our rights to freedom of assembly and expression, albeit with many limitations. But the ways in which we have laws being invoked which significantly curtail these rights, and even more than that, the way in which they're applied, which in many cases is highly arbitrary without any protections, means that many people are not able to actually participate in processes between elections, at elections, to express their views, take part in decision-making about what happens in society. And I think those are some of the really major concerns that we have to address. It's a particularly, obviously it's a very serious issue in terms of those who are directly politically engaged, but I'm just speaking for those who are not, for civil society organizations, for ordinary citizens. Many people find themselves criminalized simply for expressing their opinions about the state of society, the state of governance, and so on. We have draconian legislation, such as the Digital Security Act, which allows people to be picked up without warrant in the middle of the night, have documents seized, have their homes raided, have family members being harassed, and so on, and often not often, but quite systematically without any kind of effective protection. We have people being tried in absentia without any opportunities for being heard by the courts and so on. So those are situations, they're not exclusive to Bangladesh, of course. These are serious crises in many countries, but I think these are some of the extreme situations which go beyond the kind of what you talked about, the kind of crisis of democracy unfolding in many countries where there's a breakdown of consensus and so on. We really have this kind of abusive process of the law, which is very routine and systematic, which is part of the problems for us in trying to deal with issues even between elections. And I'm not speaking about the electoral process at all right now.
Barrister Sara Hossain, you are a lawyer, and I have a question on judicial system. So the justice sector operates within a given framework, but do you think there is a potential for innovation in the justice sector, the kind of innovation that will help advance the cause of human rights even more?
Well, as I said, first of all, I think that there are very critical issues for us to address in terms of challenges to the rule of law, in terms of absence of due process, in terms of laws that are highly arbitrary in their scope, in terms of the restrictions on freedom of association, expression, personal liberty, and many other issues. But in terms of what we can do better, measures that, not in terms of this overarching architecture or practice, but in terms of innovations that could help even within this framework. I mean, I think there are innovations which are particular to Bangladesh, which have been about using, for example, engaging people in the delivery of justice, in informal processes outside the courts, for example, through dispute resolution processes, through harnessing our own traditional methods, which have proven to be effective innovations. There are also processes that have been, I think, used by the courts themselves. For example, during this period, during the pandemic, we've seen how our courts have innovated, for example, virtual courts to try and expedite even the issuance of bail to children and juveniles who've been in prisons, get them released, in correctional centers and get them released. But I said this is happening, but these are small innovations that are successful, can be effective, but we have to bear in mind, I think, that they're happening within a context of grave abuses of power and due process. So we can't just look at the innovations on their own. We have to look at the more systemic problems that are not being addressed and that are being exacerbated as well.
Mr. Abdulwahab, CIPE works towards strengthening democracy through private enterprise and market reform. Can you help our audiences understand what role can private sector play in advancing respect for human rights? Are there examples in CIPE's work that would help illustrate this concept?
Thank you very much, Zilur. I just want to first express how impressed I am with what Barrister Sara Hossain described about innovation in the rule of law, in the judicial system in Bangladesh. Exciting stuff. I wish you the best of luck, because we all need these kinds of reform and this kind of innovative approach. So congratulations and the best of luck for Bangladesh and for you. On your question, Zilur, yes, absolutely. That's what CIPE does. That's our raison d'etre. It's about the private sector and its role in society. And before I go into that, if I may, there are certain misconceptions and myths around what a private sector is, right? So first, and I want to ask your audience and ask you, when somebody says private sector, what do you think? You think of big conglomerates, multinational companies. That's not just, the private sector is way more diverse than that. Different sectors, different sizes, different motivations. So you have, for example, we work in many countries where the importers want a set of laws and regulations that are very different than when the local manufacturers do. And I'm sure it's the same in Bangladesh. So the private sector is definitely not a monolith. And then there's the young entrepreneurs, there's women entrepreneurs. So the private sector, again, is extremely diverse. And I urge everybody not to think about it as a monolith. The second myth around this and misconception is people assume if there is a private sector in a country, then we have a market economy. That's an absolute myth, and I urge you to think of businesses around the region in South Asia, businesses in other parts of the world where either they're oligarchic or they're monopolistic, and you have strong private sector that is dominant, but you do not have a market economy. And as people at CIPE, we believe that a market economy is an important and essential and crucial condition of having a democracy. And finally, a lot of people think of the economic approach to, if the government just gets out of the way, the private sector will succeed. That's also a myth. The government is needed. The partnership between the government and the private sector is absolutely necessary to improve the conditions on the ground. And I just want to give you a couple of things that are happening today with the private sector around the globe. So first of all, the first role of a private sector is for itself to be democratic, not oligarchic, not monopolistic, transparent, believes in democracy, in part a citizen. A company is a citizen of the society it lives in. So if the environment is better, the company is better. That's number one. Number two, there have been a lot of changes recently around us that in the last couple of years that give me a lot of hope. So for example, the Business Roundtable in the US, in New York City, has come up with this new theory over a couple of years ago. It's no longer new, but they're pushing for stakeholder capitalism, stakeholder growth, not just shareholder anymore. So shareholders. So you have stakeholders, including the citizens, including employees, including others that are important for our economy, and the company should serve those too, not just the shareholders. That's a tremendous development that I urge you to follow and to be part of, because that's a shift that will affect all of us. And within that, a lot of companies right now are engaged in what's called ESG. That's the environment, social, and governance considerations that help them be part of supporting human rights, be protective of the environment, make sure there's proper governance within the company and the society and the ecosystem that they live in. So as I said, that the third myth of let the government go out, the government is needed here to regulate, to make sure that the companies are proper citizens, that the companies are good citizens with regulations, protections, protect the consumers, protect the workers, because that is also very, very important. And finally, although a lot of people see a role of the private sector in ensuring human rights, a lot of businesses suffer from a lack of human rights, right? So think of women entrepreneurs in Papua New Guinea. Think of women entrepreneurs in Bangladesh. Think of young entrepreneurs who do not have a chance to enter the economy because they lack the human rights. And I want to tell you also, I followed the Arab Spring in 2010 and 2011. That was sparked by a business person, Bouazizi in Tunisia, who had no human rights. All he wanted to do was the right to conduct his business, to sell his fruit and vegetables. He was not able to. He self-emulated. He committed suicide because he didn't have this human rights. So there's two sides to this formula, and let's not forget the human rights of the small business owner, the entrepreneur, the woman entrepreneur who cannot conduct business because she does not have that human right.
Great, and we are happy that Barrister Sara Hossain is in the studio. Barbara, they say women's rights is human rights, and we hear this motto so much that it has become cliche. Yet in practice, women's rights are hardly human rights, even in the best of conditions. What can be done to bring women's rights and the cause of women's economic empowerment to the mainstream of the fight to advance human rights? Barbara.
Thank you, Zalor. And Abdulwahab did get to the heart of this a little bit in his discussion. But what I would say is that too often, I think we as a society treat women and women's rights as a special interest group, when in fact, women represent 50% of the population of any country in the world. That's quite a powerful constituency group in terms of numbers when you think about it. But what we really must do is take a positive enabling environment. We need to create that positive enabling environment that addresses the unique barriers to women's economic empowerment. If you look at the World Bank's Women, Business, and Law report, they estimate that globally women have just about 3/4 of the rights of men. The report is a study essentially that examines 8 key areas that span a woman's life, from her education to retirement and everything that touches her economic agency in between, including her mobility, her workplace, her pay, marriage, parenthood, entrepreneurship, assets, and pension. And essentially, we know that the situation gets even more complex as we might have great laws on the books that just often aren't implemented, and social norms are challenging women's empowerment even in the most progressive of systems. And certainly with this global pandemic, this has just exacerbated these barriers and makes the urgency for resolution more apparent. For example, here in the United States, last December, as the pandemic was really sort of, in the midst of the key problems that it was facing, the US alone lost a net total jobs of 140,000 jobs lost last December, all of which were held by women. Ultimately, I think we need to create a true ecosystem of legal, regulatory, and societal empowerment, something that gives women the power of agency and the option and opportunity to choose her own path in life and not have the state or society as a whole limit her decisions.
Barrister Sara, but do you agree? Do you see a role for private enterprise in the in this field for advancing human rights? And if yes, in your opinion, what are the opportunities for partnership between private sector and the justice sector organizations to support the cause of advancing respect for human rights in Bangladesh or in the region?
Well, I think we have to talk about accountability first and foremost. I mean, just this week we've had an order from our courts about this appalling fire that happened in a juice factory back in July, where over 52 Bangladeshi citizens who were workers were burned to death because of the lack of compliance with labor standards. Unfortunately, our courts have intervened and are seeking directions and action on that. So I think accountability of the private sector, compliance with the labor legislation that we have, support for unionization, which we don't see very much. These are critical things that the private sector has to do, and companies have to do. They can't just be partners without actually subjecting themselves to the rule of law. But in terms of partnership, I mean, I think today's program is a good example that I think what digital space has enabled and what technology has enabled shows that we have potentially very strong partnerships in that space. I've joined this program for at least 10 minutes on the road through online communications. And I think we can see in Bangladesh with the commitment to a digital economy, we can see a lot of opportunities there for real partnership, including in terms of the justice sector, in terms of how to deliver services, looking at justice as a service as well. I think there are also many other opportunities for partnership, whether it's in terms of protection of workers' rights, or as we were speaking about just now in terms of women's rights, because there are real spaces where I think the private sector can sponsor all kinds of innovation from the social sector, from civil society, and we can truly be partners in that, whether it's in terms of looking at women's rights or looking, as I said, at workers' rights or many other issues. So there are opportunities, but it really has to be within a framework of accountability as well and compliance with what the law states.
Thank you. Barbara, Bangladesh has witnessed an economic boom, as many people said here, home and abroad, primarily driven by the garment sector, and thus the significance of labor rights, particularly of women laborers. What role can the private sector play in advocating for human rights of the shoulders that carry the weight of this economic boom?
Yes, thank you, Zalor, and it's great to think about this. I think what we're seeing is that the private sector is actually stepping up to lead by example, and perhaps in some cases because they've learned from some past mistakes, unfortunately. But in June, the International Labor Organization launched, and actually the convention has taken effect, Convention C190, which focuses on eliminating violence and harassment in the workplace. So companies like L'Oreal, H&M, and Gap, and Kering, which specializes in luxury goods like Gucci and Yves Saint Laurent, they've all publicly supported this convention. However, that's at that big multinational sphere, as Abdulwahab was talking about earlier. But really, there's a lot that even the micro, small, medium enterprise sector can do by simply organizing in coalitions, joining a chamber of commerce or a business association, and speaking with one voice as a proactive partner to the government, and proposing well-researched, well-balanced best practice solutions to a country's most challenging economic and social issues. And for example, actually right there in Bangladesh, CIPE had partnered with the Bangladesh Women's Chamber of Commerce and Industry several years ago. We offered some technical guidance as the chamber adapted an advocacy tool called the Women's National Business Agenda, and targeted how commercial loans were offered to micro and small women business owners, many in the garment industry. And that resulting advocacy led to 65% of commercial banks staffing dedicated desks for female borrowers. And more than $95 million in commercial loans were completed for about 10,000 women business owners, mostly small and medium enterprises, in just a matter of a few years. And that was roughly a 30% jump. BWCCI, along with their sister chambers of commerce in the region, are now replicating the dialogue that's been happening at the ILO on eliminating violence and harassment in the workplace at the country and local levels, working on dialogue with business, labor, civic, and political leaders with CIPE support, and tackling some of these human rights issues, such as eliminating violence and harassment in the workplace. And it's all looping back to that advocacy component that they've worked with us on, and learning to speak with one voice on these issues.
Barrister Sara, judiciary cannot function without access to information, access to facts, and is the right to information as it pertains to citizens equally indispensable to advancing human rights in society? And if so, what can be done to protect or advance these essential human rights?
Absolutely. I mean, we need to have, again, consistency of legislation. So we have a right to information law, but at the same time, we still have the Official Secrets Act and we have the Digital Security Act, most importantly. So even if you seek information, you will face the risk, as I said, of arrest, of incarceration, of prolonged loss of liberty, because people are routinely arrested and incarcerated for 3 months, 6 months, in some of the worst cases, 10 months and more, simply for asking questions, legitimate questions which any citizen can ask in their own society. We've seen during the pandemic that people who ask questions about the state's response to the pandemic found themselves incarcerated. One person, Mushtaq Ahmed, died in jail after spending 10 months in jail without bail under the Digital Security Act, simply for asking questions. So I think that's not an environment in which it's easy to talk about private sector partnership or any of these other issues, because if you have that level of fear in a society that by asking a question you can be deprived of your liberty, your family members can be harassed because you asked that question, that's not a sound foundation either for democratic functioning or actually for growth and development in the society. So I think absolutely agree with you, Zilur Bhai, that right to information is critical. As I said, our laws recognize, one set of laws recognizes it, another set of laws denies it, and the practice that we see happening every day around us tells us that be silent, do not ask questions, put your head down, and that is not a way on which to build a future.
Mr. Abdulwahab, what is the relationship between economic prosperity and human rights? In your opinion, can economic development be sustainable if respect for human rights is not institutionalized and enforced? What are your observations from CIPE's programmatic interventions in relation to this?
Zilur, that's an extremely important question. But if I may, I'd like to go back a little bit to what Barrister Sara Hossain mentioned at the beginning on the issue on rule of law and judiciary issues. And I'd like to emphasize that a rule of law is a necessary condition to have the proper human rights. But it's also a necessary condition to have a successful democratic business. The same laws and the same courts that protect the human right protects property rights for a business, right? The same need for access to information that Sarah was talking about for a citizen to be able to protect their human rights is the same rule for a business to be able to thrive without access to information, both no human rights and no democratic business success. So the incentive structure here is the same, to have proper human rights in a proper rule of law and to have the ability for a democratic business to thrive. But back to your question, and you hit at the crux of what CIPE does. And our value is a world where democracy delivers freedom and opportunity for all to prosper. And so for us, good growth, the proper kind of growth, is inclusive growth. That includes, everybody, not just the rich and the ones who have access to information and have all the protections, but everybody should have the same protections. And as I said before, it's a human right, in our opinion, to have opportunity to success. Now, we cannot guarantee everybody's success, right? People are different. Some will succeed, some will not. We can't guarantee that everybody will have the same prosperity as everybody else. But access to that opportunity is a right for everybody, and that's what CIPE thrives towards. And I'll give you an example of a project we had for it started for Syrian refugees in Turkey. We call it the Life Project. It's about livelihoods for these people. These are refugees who had no rights at all. But we were able to provide them with opportunity to be able to succeed. And we embarked on that project in the food industry because we know a lot of Syrians, a lot of refugees can be successful food entrepreneurs. And we help them with that, provide them with the proper equipment, proper space, proper kitchen, proper protections, proper networking. And we work with local government in Turkey to help them with the proper environment to be able to succeed. So these people have the human right of being able to provide for their family. And in addition to that, they were able to provide jobs for others working with them. And it helped ease the situation between the host community in Turkey and the Syrian and other refugees who were there to create harmony and work together instead of discord and fighting. So again, the ability to work and the ability to provide for a family and for oneself and the ability to have an opportunity to succeed is a human right. and that's extremely important. So it's not just prosperity, it's the opportunity to prosperity, and that's the relationship that we see.
Mr. Wahab, in contemporary statecraft, there does seem to be a school of thought that there is a dichotomy between advocating for human rights and being a competitive economy on the world stage. Do you believe it is possible to align a nation's economic interests with human rights advocacy?
The answer is absolutely yes. They are aligned, not just that, they have to be aligned. But allow me to throw this back at Barb. She is the expert on this issue, and she'll give you numbers and data to prove it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Barbara.
Yes, thank you so much. And honestly, Abdulwahab, I agree with you. I mean, business is not a monolith. The economic interests of nations are to be determined and thus defined by economic prosperity for all. And there's absolutely no prosperity for all without the respect for basic human rights and dignity. That's the ideal. And if we look at women's economic empowerment, it's a perfect example. The barriers to women's economic empowerment are often human rights related. And studies show that by removing these barriers, we could increase global GDP by some $28 trillion. So let's give it a go and see where we get.
But Sara, what should be the ideal level of foreign pressure among declared allies and global partners to press against human rights abuse?
Well, I don't know if I agree with the word pressure, but I think that there has to be dialogue, and this has to be an issue that's part of the agenda. We've spoken a lot about economic empowerment and prosperity, but I think we see a trend now where all our discussions increasingly globally are becoming about trade and business relations. I mean, we can't just pay lip service to what human rights is. That has to be part of the discussion, and it has to be a common struggle. It's not just for civil society to speak in a corner about human rights and that to be a separate conversation. That has to be part of the mainstream, speaking about human rights, speaking about inclusion, speaking about different communities in society and building strong societies which allow everyone to participate. I think that's part of the same conversation. So I think it's not pressure, it's an essential agenda in the dialogue between societies and between states, and it has to be a precondition, really, I think, to all of these other issues. We can't say, let's do the trade now and maybe we'll think about human rights later on. It has to be part of it and absolutely integral.
Very important issue you have raised. And any comments on Barrister Sara's observation or answers?
Yes, I do, if I may, Zillur. Thank you very much. And I tend to like what Barrister Sara Hossain says, and Barbara, of course, and I want to comment on them. It ignites something in my mind. But the issue has two sides. Issue of what kind of pressure we put, but like foreign governments put on governments that receive aid or receive investment. But the other side is what kind of pressure the community in a country can put on these investments coming into their country. And people of Bangladesh, like people anywhere in the world, should have a say on what kind of investments come to their country. They must insist, or at least work hard at making sure that these investments and this aid that comes in is constructive. It helps governance in the country. It fights corruption in the country. It improves living standards in the country, not just build bridges or build airports, right? We have to make sure that these investments are not corrosive, in the sense that some investments come and they engage in corruption. You know, they do not follow environmental laws and regulations. They do not follow the proper labor laws. They're not inclusive in transferring technology and knowledge to the local community. So the people of Bangladesh, because of Bangladeshi TV, but also all over the world, should work on making sure that the investments that are coming in are helpful to the country, not just build bridges or airports. They have to be constructive, and the environment has to work that way.
Barbara, how is it possible to bolster the power of civil society and the private sector to mobilize in the defense of human rights? Barbara.
Yes, thank you. I think a lot can be done, but one really has to differentiate about what can be done internally in a country and what level of external support could be offered. And Abdulwahab, I might actually toss this back to you. You have such a rich experience all over the globe with CIPE programs. You might have some examples that you could include.
Sure. Which aspect of it exactly you want me to address?
Yeah, I mean, pick and choose as you like.
I mean, if it's about the role of the private sector in supporting and strengthening human rights, we've addressed it already. The issue, like we said, private sector itself has to be democratic. Without a democratic private sector, you can't expect it to support democracy and human rights. So that's where we start, and that's where we move forward with.
So, Barbara?
Yeah, nothing, Zilor, to add on that.
Barrister Sara Hossain?
I think back to the same point that what Mr. Abdulwahab was saying, that people need to speak and people need to create that demand for accountability. It's a little bit circular because people need to have the space to be able to speak safely and freely. And I think we come back to that same question about do we have those enabling conditions? Is it actually possible to organize and speak out? We still have many people within Bangladesh who do raise these questions, who do try and take to the streets, who do try and demonstrate. But, simply to have a demonstration of 10 people, you need prior police permission. We have so many demonstrations that are stopped, that people are arrested before they can go out onto the streets. So I think that's not an environment in which people can claim accountability safely and freely. So I think we need to, again, go back to that question about do we have rule of law? Do we have an independent judiciary? Is it able to operate freely? Are we able to seek protection and remedy and prevention and create a space where it's possible to make these demands, whether it's around women's rights, whether it's around workers' rights, any of these issues?
Mr. Abdulwahab, although the US government has never been a consistent global backer of human rights, it is still a powerful supporter. The Trump administration's lack of commitment to the promotion of human rights was disappointing to many, but now President Biden is renewing America's commitment to leading the charge for the defense of human rights once again. In the face of this kind of on and off support from the US, is there a worry that activities surrounding human rights issues will become a seasonal endeavor dependent on the disposition of the incumbent president?
Yes, Zilor, that question has been coming up again and again, the role of the United States government in supporting human rights around the world. And the United States has been a supporter of democracy globally for a long, long time. What we should focus on is more the support for, as we talked about before, democratic values, not just democratic processes. A lot of the support has come to support elections, which is good, developing political parties, which is good, training parliamentarians and parliaments and making sure they work well. And all of this is important. What we should strive towards also is supporting the value of democracy and human rights in bilateral relationships. However, I'd like to emphasize for everybody that's in our field, ourselves, that's the democracy activists, to develop relationships, not just bilateral government to government. Work with American civil society. There are fantastic American organizations whose only reason to exist is to support democracy around the world. CIPE is one of them. I urge you, contact us. If there's anything we can do to help, we've more than happy to. There's the National Endowment for Democracy. There are a lot of human rights organizations in the United States. So civil society and citizen-to-citizen work is absolutely important. And the American people and the American institutions are also supporters of democracy. Don't forget that.
Barbara, are Western standards of human rights absolute? How do you see the Eastern standard of human rights, which advocates for collective rights over individual rights? Which is more important, catering to an individual or collective rights?
Well, I think this question, it combines perhaps a little bit more than is safe to do so. Philosophical notions with practical benefits and democracy offers to its citizens. Philosophically speaking, the only absolute is change. Everything else is irrelevant. But practically speaking, human rights as a value set must have universal standards. That is why we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For sure, it's an adaptation to different contexts, particularly its enforcement and practical implementation in each country can differ. But that's not to say that those values are not universal. Human ability to own, embody, promote, and enforce those standards can be different in different places, and improving the practical state of affairs is part of our never-ending effort to perfect our democracies.
Barrister Sara Hossain, how are human rights violated in democratic societies? What measures do the governments of such democracies take to suppress and influence public opinion?
Well, we've seen, as I've mentioned a great deal, I think, about the kinds of laws we have, which are arbitrary and excessive and that allow curtailing of personal liberty simply for speech and organization. But I think in addition to that, going back to the question of rule of law and protection, I mean, it's critical to have independent institutions. It's critical to have law enforcing agencies that are not politically controlled. It's critical to have a judicial space where you can go, where there is due process observed and maintained. I think these are some of the spaces where we see major gaps and constraints, where we see the judiciary under threat, not able to operate freely and openly as we would require. And those are some of the ways in which we see, even, I think you said democratic, quote unquote. So that's how we see governments operating. I think also now it's important to acknowledge what's also happening in online space, because that is really the place where so many people now live, as offline spaces also become more restrictive in different ways. And there too, I think the role of, particularly the role of different digital platforms is particularly important for us to track how those are being used, and I guess infiltrated and controlled, even not controlled, but infiltrated and utilized in some ways. It's part of the same process of trying to shut down how civil society can operate and how democratic space actually functions. And again, this is not a situation that is common to Bangladesh alone. We see it in many countries at the moment. But I think those are also new challenges that are in front of us. And whether it's in the US or here, I think we've seen how that's been incredibly dangerous, continues to be incredibly dangerous for democratic aspirations.
So we are almost at the end of the program. Any final remarks from you? Barbara, you have 2 minutes.
Yes, thank you so much, Delor, for this opportunity. I mean, I think it's clear that democracy, human rights, and economic empowerment, particularly when it comes to women, really go hand in hand. And I would just encourage all of us to look at the Democracy Summit that is happening across the globe and echo those dialogues at our community level.
Mr. Abdulwahab?
Nothing but to thank you, Zelor, for the opportunity to come here and to repeat the importance between the proper democratic private sector, the ability of the private sector to succeed, and a proper rule of law that protects human rights, protects the right of assembly, protects the right of speech, protect all of these rights, women's empowerment, all of that, they are intertwined. And I just want to end with what, again, I apologize for always taking on what Barrister Sara Hossain takes and follow up with it. I enjoy what she says. The issue of the digital space right now and the abuses that we have in it, it will not be legislated away. Just passing laws will not take care of it. You need the proper partnership between governments that legislate, create regulations, with civil society that works with it, with the citizens, but also with the private sector that has a technological know-how and the incentives to protect itself and citizens from it. So it's a partnership, and all of us have to work together to make sure there's a democratic space for everybody to thrive.
Sara Hossain.
Thank you, Zilur Bhai. I think we have to be able to carry on investigating, monitoring, and documenting what is happening in terms of human rights in our own countries and also globally. I think when people, as Mr. Wahab said, that we should communicate people across borders. When that happens, people should not be called conspirators or anti-nationals or anti-state agents because they're talking about what happens in their own country to their own compatriots. So that's what we need to be able to keep doing, telling the stories, writing, organizing, working, and trying to undo these shackles around us, whether they're in terms of the legislation or the practices, and keep on being able to demand independent institutions and democratic practices.
Thank you, Mr. Abdulwahab Alkebsi, Ms. Barbara Langley, and Barrister Sara Hossain for giving us your insights on the crucial issue. Whether we are all born equal or not, as humans, we should have the same rights and liberties. Democracy and human rights are two sides of the same coin. There are no human rights without democracy, and democracy cannot be established without human rights. A person's human rights cannot be taken away. In its final article, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that no state, group, or persons has any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act aimed at the destruction of any of the rights and freedoms. We should continue to focus our attention and effort behind upholding human rights and take action against wherever rights are being violated. Human rights instruments that protect the rights of certain groups of people, for example, women, indigenous peoples, minorities, and people with disabilities, are critical for democracy because they provide access to information, freedom from fear, participation, and equality and equity for all. Today, the majority of countries in the world regard themselves as democratic. However, democracy is a dynamic social and political system that is neither linear nor irreversible, and all nations may benefit from ongoing democratic process development. Democratic governance is a key component in ensuring the formation and upkeep of human rights instruments. When institutions are not transparent and accountable, elections are not genuine, public freedoms and democratic space is restricted, and decision making is not participatory. Furthermore, the legitimacy of governments is compromised, and there is an increase in polarization and tensions among groups. The civil society of Bangladesh, which once valiantly paved the way towards freedom of expression, liberation, and independence, now lies dormant. The question now remains, what will it take for them to awaken once more for the cause of democracy? Thank you, viewers. Thank you for joining with us.